The IPCC put out a report in, I think it was 2012 or 2014, where they said that 111 out of 114 of their climate simulations overstated warming when compared with measurable data. Controversially, Europe, particularly Northern Europe, would be significantly better off with a warmer climate than it is today. So we have between
Okay.
6 and 8,000 people dying prematurely every year as a result of fuel poverty. If the country was warmer, then the impact of being unable to heat your home would be reduced, and so those numbers would fall. But interestingly, the Canadian regulator said that if a human being was going to power their entire energy needs from nuclear for their entire life, the waste would fit into a drinks can. Policymakers tell us that renewables are cheap. They throw out numbers like 9 times cheaper than gas. This is just not true. Um, since 2006, we've spent over 220 or almost 220 billion pounds in today's money unnecessarily on the energy transition with zero financial benefit. And Germany is now actually reconsidering its position on nuclear. They've seen their emissions go up again because they shut nuclear. That meant they had to rely more on coal, and they use the dirtiest form of coal, lignite. They've actually been dismantling wind farms to expand lignite mines. And we can't. Why is it that people say they care about climate change? You know, for most people, it's because they worry about the impact on lives and livelihoods that climate change might have. So it's pretty perverse then to enact policies designed to tackle climate change that create harm to lives and livelihoods. So when you've got Miliband saying, oh, you'll see £300 off your bills in 2030, well, not according to the CCC. The CCC says it'll keep going up until 2038. And um, and even then, that's probably optimistic because their assumptions are unrealistic. I'm quite interested in helping interested parties to understand energy better. So I talk with politicians, sadly not from the government, but I've talked quite a lot with Conservatives in Reform. Had somebody from the Scottish Parliament reach out to me recently, speaking to Ofgem. And then, my column and doing the YouTube channel is about engagement with the general public because it's an area of such interest, but people have fairly low levels of understanding. So it's just about trying to build the general understanding that people have of energy and why some of the narratives that have been peddled over the recent years around renewables being cheap, suppliers being greedy, and all this stuff, and just not really true. And there's other dynamics that are driving pricing and other risks that we face beyond just cost.
Well, let's crack on with that. Then I garnered an awful lot of questions. I mean, it's amazing actually. You think perhaps young people aren't necessarily that interested in these things, and maybe some are. But I'll tell you what, when they get going, and also what they enjoy doing is some detective work online and finding out about people in a nice way, But there's lots that can be discovered, and so I think I think it's quite so. Some
So
of the
they'll
questions.
come across the DSMOG article that accuses me of being a climate denier then.
Oh, I think yes. That's been picked up, of course. Yes, and that's the most exciting, you see. Well, not the most exciting, but it's an exciting angle for them. But this is good because one of the things these guys, because they're scientists, what they need to be learning, is all the usual thing, not the usual things, but the things that perhaps you would recognize as obvious, is misinformation and poor information and bias, and the internet's a wonderful trove of stuff, but on the other hand, you've got to be canny and thoughtful about, what's
Yeah.
being said and why people have the opinions they do. And then it's interesting for these
I mean, so
people as it is.
DSMOG, their evidence of me being a denier was I wrote a couple of posts challenging, and this was a few years ago now, challenging the IPCC because I'm not that interested in climate science. I'm more interested in the policy outcomes of climate science and how it impacts energy policy and then
Mhm.
economic consequences of that, and social to a certain extent when we're talking about blackouts and energy poverty. Um, but the IPCC put out a report in, I think it was 2012 or 2014, where they said that 111 out of 114 of their climate simulations overstated warming when compared with measurable data.
Right,
So I'm
right.
like, well, that's and then they wrote loads of pages about why that didn't matter and why their models were perfectly fine and their hypotheses were perfectly fine. So I'm like, that's not science. right? In science, you form a hypothesis, you test it. If the data don't support your hypothesis, you change your hypothesis. You don't make excuses. And so I was criticizing their adherence to the scientific method. In that same report, they said they increased their confidence level from 95 to 99% that climate change was man-made in origin. And I'm like, well, I don't believe you because, you've just told me that your models are useless. So, deal with your modeling before you start making these sort of wild assertions that don't seem founded in any sort of real science. So D-Smog interpreted this as climate denial. And I'm like, no, we're spending trillions of dollars worldwide on the energy transition. Don't you think we should be on really solid ground around the modeling that informs that? And if 111 out of 114 of your models are showing this really major directional bias, go and do better, right? That's not proper science. But apparently that makes me a denier.
Okay, well, it doesn't make you a denier. It does make you pushing up back against the sort of status quo and the present received wisdom on these things. I guess, and of course that's absolutely fine. Well, maybe we can dig into that a bit more. So I ought to introduce you, really. Kathryn Porter of What Logic, an incredibly busy individual at the moment, as I understand it, talking to an awful lot of people and groups about energy, policies of energy, politics around energy, how we can ensure we provide enough energy at a price we can manage, and how that isn't fitting into present policies in the UK and maybe further afield. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your exceptionally busy schedule to chat with me, the next person in your round of discussions. I wanted to start off with something slightly different. Measures of energy are a bit abstract. So something more concrete is how fast something's moving. If you say someone might be able to run at 10 miles an hour, but their car can go at 100 miles an hour, then we can kind of visualize those speeds and it makes some sense. But energy is a little bit trickier, although people tend to have some sort of a handle on calories, already kilocalories. I took a few notes here and ran a few very basic numbers. So an average person a day, and of course people vary quite wildly in how much energy they use for various reasons, but an average person a day might burn something like 2,500 kilocalories, or colloquially calories. That's about
No,
10,000
they don't.
kilojoules.
Not these days.
You think
That's
it's
why
more?
everyone's so fat, because they think they're burning 2,500 calories. An average type woman will probably burn about 1,600 calories in a day if she
Only
has a
60.
relatively sedentary lifestyle. So this is why everyone ends up being fat, because the official data still say 2,000 for women and 2,500 for men, but it's just too many. We're too sedentary to eat that much
Okay. So I'll
and
adjust
not
that.
end up being,
The average active person.
yeah, they have to be active.
Okay. So something like that to get a ballpark figure. I'll take your point. That's something like 100 watts. So their rate of energy use, because watts is a rate, is something like 100 watts, maybe a bit less. That is the equivalent of if you have on your dining room table, it's a fancy dinner, and you put two candles on the table and you burn those candles together. Collectively, they're burning about 100 watts. So it's about 50 watts a candle as it happens. They're producing about 50 watts of heat each. Now, the average home uses a day something like 20,000 kilocalories, 20,000. Okay, so something like an order of magnitude more to keep that house going with typically electricity and gas. That's something like 1,000 watts average rate through the day. Hinkley Point C, which is a nuclear power station, or will be a nuclear power station, will provide, I understand it, and I've got this here, 3.2 gigawatts it's claiming to. Let's hope that's true. About 3.2. Okay. So that works out, it should power the need for about 6 million homes, which sounds amazing to me. One power station could support 6 million homes. That's the equivalent heat produced by about 32 million humans, if we bring it back to humans. So Hinkley Point C, about 32 million humans. Now, you may know the film The Matrix of 1999, a long time ago now. The film The Matrix, where the overall conceit was that the robots had taken over and they were harvesting human bodies to use as an energy source. Now, I think the film's fantastic, but this idea of why they would subjugate humans for energy source is absolutely mental because, of
There are
course, you might as
better
well.
energy sources.
There are better energy sources than human beings by a very long way, such as nuclear power, but we'll come on
Yeah.
to that a bit more later. Maybe other energy
And you
sources
get
too.
into the question about how efficiently do humans convert their input energy into output energy, which why can they not just use whatever the fuel was they were giving the humans as their energy source and like skip the human bit?
Bingo, bingo. So maybe 20% conversion rate. So if you're feeding them, you would say 2,000 or even 1,600 kilocalories a day, you're only getting 20% of that out the other end as heat, let's say, in human beings. So no, absolutely awful idea by these robots. Absolutely terrible. There are about 30 million homes in the UK. So one modern, let's say, nuclear reactor would power about a fifth of all these UK homes. So interestingly, in principle, you could have 5 modern nuclear reactors to
Mm.
power all the homes. No?
No, yeah. So the trouble is with these average consumption of the home analyses is that they assume static consumption, and obviously our consumption isn't static through the day. So our peak winter demand is something like 47 gigawatts.
Wow.
Um, so you've got that how you have to size the grid is for your peak demand, not your average demand.
Okay. Okay. Right. Great point. And we'll come on to that later. But yes. Okay. So we'd actually need a lot more because of the fluctuations. And I'm working only on averages here. This is my first mistake. Right. Now, nonetheless, Hinkley Point C uh, will support a lot of homes, but it'll produce about, as I understand it, about four. I'm sure this is very approximate. About 400 tons of waste a year. 400 tons. That's about 1,000 meters cubed. Now, most of this, I've got to check my notes here. Most of this is low level waste, so basically not really much of a problem. The high level stuff
That's
needs
correct.
cooling, shielding, and then stuck, yeah, deep into the ground, which I think sometimes happens already. 1,000 meters
Oh,
cubed
not in
by,
this country. So Finland is building an underground depository, but nobody else has one yet. But interestingly, the Canadian regulator said that if a human being was going to power their entire energy needs from nuclear for their entire life, the waste would fit into a drinks can.
okay, so per person for their whole life, you've got about a drinks can of waste.
Yeah.
Okay.
Volumetrically, the waste is quite small. And certainly when you set it off against all the other toxic waste that's produced by industry, it's a tiny fraction.
Okay, so you
Because
preempted the,
radioactivity is not the only source of toxicity. So, you have chemical stuff which is, extremely toxic. You can't just leave it lying around. It's just not radioactive. So yeah, nuclear waste is very volumetrically small compared with the other toxic waste that's produced by the economy.
and this radioactive waste, the form of toxicity we're getting from nuclear, presently the best way to deal with that is stick it deep into the ground.
Yeah, so we don't currently do that. We're planning to in the long term, but because the volumes are so small, there's not really any rush. We can easily handle the waste that we have. I think a lot of people get distracted by Sellafield, but Sellafield is where all our legacy waste from, the 50s and 60s, from both civil and military nuclear waste was put, and it wasn't either documented very well or handled very well at the time. So there's a very significant cleanup operation to be done around poor handling of legacy waste in previous decades. If we stop nuclear today, we'd still have to deal with that because that problem doesn't disappear if we closed our nuclear reactors. So when people think about waste, they often get sidetracked by the Sellafield question, but that is going to exist regardless because it was to do with legacy errors, if you like. The way we handle waste now is very safe, very contained, very clean. And because it's volumetrically small, we don't really have to worry about it. We don't have to hurry to find a geological repository because we just don't need to. There's not enough of it to make that a priority.
Okay. Okay, that's covered off the sort of first main question I had. So volumetrically, it's small. It's not much of an issue. That's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
World CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions are up from something like 20 billion tons per year 40, 45 years ago to, in the last couple of years, something like 37 tons. So that's nearly a doubling in that period of time. Obviously, population levels have gone up, countries are more developed, they produce more waste and so forth. And global air temperatures, as I understand it, are up not quite 1 degree in that same period. Okay. Now, we're not here to talk so much about climate science, but let's assume, if you're happy to, but tell me if you're not, let's assume that that's a problem if it continues. If that trend continues, it may, the rate of warming increase may increase or it may not. But if it continues, if we continue to warm, there's likely to be a number of associated problems. Now, I spoke with Matt Ridley, who I think you'd know.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. I had the pleasure of speaking to him recently. He felt that the problems associated with climate change or global warming are overblown. He cites long-term reductions in deaths due to high temperatures. So if temperatures may be going up, they're a bit hotter in the
So
summer, for
cold
example,
kills more people than heat.
the cold, and then in fact, if it's getting less cold in the winter, that may more than offset the fact that it's getting a bit hotter in the summer in terms of deaths. Plus, we're better at mitigating against.
Controversially, Europe, particularly Northern Europe, would be significantly better off with a warmer climate than it is today. So we have between 6,000 and 8,000 people dying prematurely every year as a result of fuel poverty. If the country was warmer, then the impact of being unable to heat your home would be reduced, and so those numbers would fall. So I'm not suggesting this is a justification for inaction, but it is, I think, pretty uncontrovertible that Northern Europe would be better off. Fewer people would die, life would be more comfortable if it was hotter. And I think the other thing that is worth noting is that since the beginning of human existence, there have been mass migrations of people, largely to do with environmental factors. And it seems somewhat strange to me that we suddenly think now in the modern era that should stop. I think there will be some situations where the most sensible option is simply to move the people rather than to try and prevent the climate change, because I don't really believe that it's necessarily possible to prevent climate change. Some of the climate change we're experiencing is not man-made in origin. And, I think where people try to deny that, I think it's foolish, because the climate has been manifestly changing since the Earth first acquired an atmosphere. Anecdotal records suggest that Britain was probably a couple of degrees warmer in Roman times. They were drinking wine made from grapes grown in Yorkshire, for example. I don't think that the Romans had a particular fondness for sour wine, coming from Italy, where obviously grapes will ripen a lot more. So if they were drinking wine made from Yorkshire, that suggests that grapes were able to ripen better than they can today. And there's various other evidence that would support that as well, that it was warmer then than it is now. So we know in the pre-industrial age, climate was changing. So you have one question is, to what extent is human activity changing, accelerating, moderating the effect of climate change? So some of that would have happened anyway. And then the other one is, to what extent should we mitigate the impact rather than try and prevent it? And I certainly think that where people assume that you have to prevent sea levels from rising to flood low-lying islands, that I think that's potentially a foolish ambition, and that you should just look more at moving some of those people rather than preventing them from needing to move. I think it's unrealistic to prevent all of it.
Okay, so playing devil's advocate, those people on those islands are not going to want to move, of course, and they won't want to hear other people saying, you have to move. We're going to have to move you off of your land, maybe your indigenous lands, to another place.
But how would you prevent it? Because given that some element of climate change would happen anyway, even if we ceased all industrial activity around the world, it might be the case that those islands would flood regardless. So then what are you going to do? Are those people just going to sit there out of stubbornness because they don't want to leave? No, they'll move, as they have done for millennia. People have moved. And then the other consideration is that in order to facilitate the energy transition, you need to massively increase extraction of critical minerals from the earth. So that involves polluting the environments that lots of other people live in, also on indigenous lands elsewhere, for example, in South America. Chile is a huge producer of copper. Copper is an essential mineral for the energy transition, and you need 15 tons of copper per megawatt of offshore wind. The soil in Chile is very rich in arsenic. To open a new copper mine involves blasting all this arsenic into the air. That then is breathed in by people. It falls down onto the ground in rain, so it damages crops. It pollutes water sources. It kills fish. It gets into drinking water and all the rest of it. So they have much higher instances of cancer around these mines. So you're essentially creating a trade-off where one group of people might find their islands that they live on flooded, and you want to prevent that by poisoning a load of other people in some other part of the world. Now, who makes that decision? Who decides that you should poison those people in South America in order to save the people in the Indian Ocean from having to move?
Good point.
They're not, these are not neutral choices. So, and I think that gets a bit lost in the mix, that people don't look at the full environmental footprint of the energy transition. They assume it's all about carbon dioxide, but poisoning people in South America is not necessarily a good trade-off. Maybe the United Nations will decide it is, but then, like, who are we in Britain to sit here and decide that that's okay? Well, we're neither at risk of flooding nor at risk of being poisoned by the extra mining activity.
Well, we are okay. Yes, I just to point out, I think there are arguments to say we're risk of flooding. We're at risk of flooding, sort of internally, in the sense of rivers and so forth flooding. I've heard some
but not to the
statistics.
same degree as our entire
Agreed.
island being wiped out, as
Yes.
some Indian Ocean locations might be. So I think, those sorts of massive global level trade-offs are not possible for any individual nations to determine anyway. And of course, I have sympathy for people whose homes are at risk from flooding, but equally, I have sympathy for the people who live in mineral rich areas where quite often the indigenous peoples are being heavily exploited. Um, and they're suffering serious health detriments and serious detriments to their living conditions and their environment. And so I don't think you can neglect that. And then also you have the other issue of human created or more human created stuff like the forced labor in China, which affects so many of the energy transition supply chains. Um, so this is not, it's not a one-dimensional problem. And I think too often it is reduced just to the carbon dioxide question. And I think that's wrong. It's much more complex than that.
Why do you think it is then, given your point of view, which you state eloquently, why do you think it is that nations around the world, and particularly Western nations, have become focused on the issue of CO2, and they sometimes throw in methane as well? Is it, for example, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, because they've separated the science from the social aspects, that we've got very focused on numbers about CO2 levels and IPCC reports and so forth? Could that be the reason? Why is it that the government here became so focused, particularly a few years ago, and you'll need to flesh out the details for me here, that it passed a bill regarding climate change, which means that pretty much any policy that the government rolls out needs to be assessed based on climate change costs of those plans, and maybe scuppered because of that through the climate change committee. I think, why is it that we focus so much on CO2 emissions to the detriment of people's living in China, slave labor in sub-Saharan Africa, copper arsenic issues in South America, as you describe it, and so forth?
Oh, well, because it's simple and because hardly anybody in Whitehall or Westminster has any sort of scientific training. And so they're simply not capable of interrogating data in a rigorous way. And we saw this very clearly during COVID, that a lot of the decision making didn't stack up. Again, I mean, they said things like follow the science. Well, that is actually quite a dumb thing to say, because the science might suggest that you're better off if all people over the age of 70 were dead, for example, or you go to extreme lengths to stop all people over 70 from dying. It should always be tempered with wider considerations. And so, but because most of them weren't comfortable with science, they'd come out with, oh, we'll follow the science. Well, there's no such thing as the science. Science is never settled, because that's just not how science works. And unless you have some training in science, you're just going to be very misled. So carbon dioxide is a really easy metric for them to land on, but actually the target is total nonsense because all the target looks at territorial production emissions. It doesn't look at consumption. But we would meet our target because the target's measuring the wrong thing. So they pick on this stuff because it's easy, simple to understand. They're not technically minded. They're quite naive. This stuff is presented in the sense of we're going to save the planet, and what sort of a psychopath doesn't want to save the planet? And so they vote for these things. And also 2050 at the time seemed like a really long way in the future. There was no plan for delivery. There was no feasibility study. There was no cost benefit analysis. There was no risk analysis. There was nothing. It was just like, yeah, saving the climate sounds like a good thing. I don't want to vote against that because then I'll look like a really bad person.
Okay. So, okay. So we are where we are at this moment in time with Britain's policies. Actually, could you very briefly describe what Britain's energy policies are, sort of in terms of what the mix is of energy producing systems in the UK and what we're moving towards at the current trajectory?
Okay, well, I would describe it as delusional. Um, we still our primary energy is still oil and gas, but for reasons better known to themselves, the Labour government and Ed Miliband seem to be extremely reluctant to produce the stuff ourselves. They seem to think importing it is better. That makes no sense. We have some of the highest environmental standards in the world around production of oil and gas. So obviously, as soon as you import it, you lose control of those production standards, and then you get the shipping emissions as well. So not producing our own oil and gas when we can is idiotic. And also it's economically disadvantageous because we earn a lot of revenues through taxation on oil and gas production, which we don't get when we're importing. Plus you have the whole balance of trade issue. So I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And our consumption isn't falling in any meaningful way, not over the short to medium term. In the electricity sector, we did the transition from coal to gas. That had absolutely zero to do with environmental concerns. It was driven by the fact that we felt we were running out of economically viable coal and simultaneously discovered resources of natural gas. And so we just thought it would make good sense to switch from coal to gas in the power sector. That had the side benefit of reducing emissions significantly. But if it had been the other way around, we would have made the opposite choice. You know, if we'd been running out of gas and discovered coal, we would have switched to coal, and then we'd just be crying about the emissions. So it's very much fake to say, oh, well, we did this transition and we still had economic growth. The transition was not motivated by climate concerns. It was purely coincidental. And the reason we still had economic growth was because of all the other factors, not the energy factor. And actually, we were choosing the cheaper form of energy. The policy in the power sector now is to move towards weather-based renewables. Again, this is an idiotic strategy. So we could meet the target right now by closing all of our manufacturing and moving it to China. What would that do to global emissions? It would make them go up because Chinese energy is dirtier than our energy, and then you'd incur shipping emissions bringing all the stuff back here. Policymakers tell us that renewables are cheap. They throw out numbers like 9 times cheaper than gas. This is just not true. Since 2006, we've spent over 220 or almost 220 billion pounds in today's money unnecessarily on the energy transition with zero financial benefits. We have seen no reduction in bills. For more than 2 decades before the gas crisis, wholesale gas and electricity prices were essentially stable. They were flat and low volatility. But from 2006, you see a big divergence with domestic prices. They started to increase quite dramatically. And that was driven by transition policies. In fact, we're subsidizing wind and solar to significant degrees. We started subsidizing wind in 1990, and it was justified on the basis that this was an immature technology that needed support in the early days. Well, after 35 years, if your technology still requires subsidies, and actually now the subsidies are going up again, I would say there's something fundamentally wrong with that technology, that it's never going to be economically viable. And in fact, that's what we see. Last year, the average wholesale price of electricity was £73 per megawatt hour. That's the price based on gas. The subsidy price for offshore wind last year in the latest auction was £83 a megawatt hour, so 13% higher than the gas-based electricity price. And even then, Ørsted cancelled the flagship project on the basis it was uneconomic. So 13% higher than the supposedly expensive gas-based power price is not enough. And that's just the first order cost of renewables. The subsidy, then you have the backup costs, the extra grid costs because it has very low energy density, so you need a lot more wires to connect it. The fact that you can't use all of the energy because of underinvestment in grid infrastructure, so you have curtailment costs. And then the weather effect creates real-time balancing costs that add billions of pounds a year onto our bills. So renewables are not and never will be cheap. So the focus on that is going to support energy prices and keep energy prices high forever, fundamentally.
Can I just pick you? That's fantastic. I just want to cut in there. So you made the argument that the prices from renewables, the electricity price generated from renewables is very expensive, but you've also dropped the bombshell that they're never going to be cheap. Now, I wonder if we can explore that a bit more, because I think the argument would be that the cost of the technologies is coming down.
No, it's not, though.
That,
That's the point. It's going
that,
up.
bear with me, okay, that as we scale it, it will become cheaper.
After 35 years, we now have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind connected to the British grid. That is almost the same as our summer demand. Right, so it's scaled. This technology is mature. We are not going to get price reductions from increasing maturity. We've already extracted all of the experience benefits.
Okay. We're a windy country. We can produce a lot of we produce, I beg your pardon. Well, we can produce a lot of electricity from wind, which is produced around
Wind has
our
a capacity
island.
factor of 35%, and the best sites have already been taken. Developers are now objecting to other developments because of wake issues and effectively new projects stealing their wind.
What do you produce? Okay, I'll give up on that line of devil's advocacy. What
No,
do
but
you
this is part of this is part of the misinformation that people get fed.
Mhm.
The capital and operating costs of wind are not falling. And anybody can find this out for themselves, because in Britain, wind farms are incorporated as special purpose vehicles. So each wind farm operating company is a limited company which files its accounts at Companies House. And because these SPVs don't employ staff, the accounts give you a pretty clean view of the economics of the wind farm itself. And so you can, with making a couple of adjustments for differences in accounting policies, you can then look at what are the capital costs, what are the operating costs. And Gordon Hughes at University of Edinburgh has done a lot of work around this. And his work demonstrates quite clearly from these data that you did see cost reductions up until the mid 2010s. And then from there, the costs have been going back up. And we also see this reflected in the subsidy round. So AR4 was the cheapest subsidy round, and the prices there were pretty low. But what happened to that round? So there were essentially 5 big offshore wind projects. One of them was just cancelled altogether, never been built. The other 4 took the maximum 25% of their capacity that they could and rebid it in AR6 at much higher prices. And they were lobbying the government for extra tax incentives because they couldn't make the economics work. Basically, that they gamed the system and lost. But so those projects will lose money. And we're seeing that, Ørsted losing lots of money. At the time this was happening, the turbine manufacturers were losing billions of dollars a year. Those losses started in 2018. So not to do with COVID or Ukraine, as people claim. They predated all of that. Now that they're pushing back on warranties and they've increased their prices, and investors has increased its prices a lot, that's feeding through into the developers, and then they're requesting higher subsidies to cover all these price increases and stricter warranty conditions. So AR5 attracted 0 bids for offshore wind. AR6 came along and, as I said, priced higher than the current wholesale price. Now the auction happened in April, so we didn't know what the 2024 power price would be. But, the outturn was 13% lower than the subsidy level. And gas prices are falling. So we are not going to see renewables being cheap. And just because the short run marginal cost of renewables is low doesn't mean the system cost is low. You need to build extremely expensive machines to capture that energy from wind and sun. So it's not free, as people think. Wind and sun you don't pay anything for, but the machine you have to build to harness that energy is far from free. Then it's the intermittency really kills you. 35% for wind. So essentially a third, it only works a third of the time. And with solar, it's only 10%. That Britain is the second worst country in the world after Ireland, according to World Bank data, for solar, because our irradiation levels are so low. So
Second worst
this
in the world,
stuff,
blimey.
yeah. So we're spending all this money, we're spending billions of pounds to subsidize this generation that only works a fraction of the time. And then obviously you're going to have something else to be available when it's not windy and sunny. So it should be pretty evident. It should be self-evident that if you just ran your system on the something else, it would be cheaper than running it with the wind and solar.
So you need two systems, even if wind and solar are somewhat effective, which you're arguing they're not. When the sun isn't shining or the wind's not blowing, you need a backup system to produce the power that people require. And so you've got a dual system working and being maintained, and that's obviously expensive.
Now, our peak energy demand happens at dinner time in the winter. Guess what you don't have at dinner time in the winter?
Well, wind
There
or
is
indeed solar.
zero sun because it's after sunset.
Yeah.
So you get nothing from solar. And so what? You get 10, 12 gigawatts on a day like today when your demand is low because there's no heating need. We haven't built out that much air conditioning yet, although if we move to heat pumps, that will change because heat pumps can provide cooling. And then despite the fact that we have more than 30 gigawatts of wind installed, right now we've got just open this. Right now we've got 2.7 gigawatts generating.
Oh gosh, not
And in a
enough.
few days' time, it's predicted to go down to 600 megawatts. So
Okay.
despite all of these masses and masses, actually lunchtime tomorrow, it's now forecast at 653 megawatts. So all that 30 gigawatts is going to give us 650 megawatts of generation.
I mean, that's devastatingly bad by the sounds of it. Sorry, can you elucidate for me? Sorry, pardon my slowness. Can you elucidate for me why those numbers are so different on such a good day?
Well, it's not a good day. We're sitting here in a high pressure weather system, which is characterized by stillness.
Okay. So we're getting
and
very
in the
little.
summer, that's fine because it gives you sunshine. In the winter, yes, you get sunshine, but the sun is set by the time you get to peak demand. So you have zero solar because it's nighttime, and then you've got no wind because you're in a high pressure weather system, which is not windy. And these conditions can last for weeks. Like this is what we're experiencing right now. Been going on for weeks. We've had a few days here and there where it's been cooler and wet, but fundamentally this summer has been dry and still. So was summer of 2022. We went for something like 3 consecutive weeks with really low wind output. That also affected, because that particular weather system sat off the east coast of England, you had all the other countries in Northern Europe similarly affected. So Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, all of these countries are following a similar transition strategy to us, so heavy reliance on wind. We rely heavily on imports of electricity now, but if the countries you're connecting with don't have it to spare because it's not windy there either, our get out of jail free card at the moment is France with their nuclear, and their fleet is getting old. They've had 2 occasions in 6 years where they've had to take large parts of the fleet offline to deal with problems. And then Norway with its hydro, but they don't have any pumping, so their hydro can run out. They've amended their Energy Act twice to give themselves the rights to restrict exports if they think the water levels are getting too low. And actually, this summer, there are some forecasts to say that they might see 25-year reservoir lows, in which case they might very well just stop exporting altogether. So, and it's become quite a political hot potato in Norway, so they might actually try and cancel the interconnector deals altogether. They've got parliamentary elections in September that will be quite crucial for this question. So if we can't rely on imports, either because the countries don't want to export to us, or because they can't because it's not windy there either, we've not got wind generating anything because the weather doesn't suit it. It happens to be the winter, so solar's not generating because it's nighttime. Then you're in trouble.
So without her, I'm not fishing for hyperbole here, but do you predict blackouts for Britain in the foreseeable future?
I predict rationing if we don't act soon. So one of the big problems we have is retirement risk with our conventional generation. A third of our gas power stations were built in the 1990s. Now, gas turbines will typically last 25 to 30 years. Most of those units did have some major refurbishments done in the 2000s that would take them to a 30-year life. But we're kind of getting to that point now. And there's no plan to manage this retirement. I mean, NESO has said it wants all of the gas fleet to remain as reserve for the Clean Power 2030 plan. The idea that unabated gas will only be used 5% to meet 5% of average annual demand. But if a third of the fleet closes because it's old, and you have an 8-year lead time to buy a new gas turbine, then you're in trouble. And then you've also got all of the nuclear power stations, apart from Sizewell B, are currently scheduled to close by 2028, I think, the furthest date. Now, I think they'll get extended again, but definitely not past 2032. So I think we'll see 2 of them close in 2030, the other 2 close in 2032. So in that horizon, you've got 15 gigawatts of capacity potentially closing. And we're not seeing demand fall by 15 gigawatts. If anything, well, NESO thinks demand will increase because of electrification. Deindustrialization is pushing it the other way at the moment, but it's not going to fall by that degree. So how will you manage that if you don't build more conventional generation? And this is what you need. You need conventional generation. You need it within the next 5 to 7 years. The only other thing you're going to be able to do is ration.
Can Rolls-Royce come to our rescue?
No.
Too short a time frame.
Yeah, I mean, Rolls-Royce might get something to market in 10 years.
We're talking small nuclear power
Yeah,
stations.
small
Sorry,
modular reactors. So the misconception people have about this is they think, oh, well, they have these nuclear powered submarines, so why can they not just take the reactor out of the submarine, stick it on the dock, and plug it into the grid? Well, the answer to that is no, because nuclear submarines use highly enriched fuel that's not licensed anywhere in the world for civil use because of proliferation concerns. And it's not likely that that restriction will be lifted. So they've had to design an entirely new type of reactor using conventional fuel for their small modular reactors. They've just started with a fresh piece of paper, and our regulators are slow and inefficient, and it's taking a long time to get it approved. The first small modular reactors in the West have literally just started construction in Canada. It's a boiling water reactor technology being built by GE Hitachi. Everyone else is looking at pressurized water. And I actually think the boiling water is a better option, but they've literally only just started building those. The best thing that we could do actually in real life would be to pass a law mandating the construction of the Korean APR 1400, their large gigawatt scale nuclear reactors, and legislate to bypass the regulatory procedures because they're just too slow and they're massively inefficient. This reactor design, not only is it actually in operation in Korea and UAE, it's also been certified by the NRC in the US and also by European regulators. Now, the US has a much wider range of environmental factors to consider than we do. They have hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. We don't have any of that stuff. So if the NRC is satisfied with the safety case and the technology, then we should be too. So we should just legislate to approve these reactors in law, bypass all of the regulations, build them, and borrow public money to finance the first 2, because KEPCO has built these things on average 5 to 6 billion US each. Hinkley Point is going to cost 35 billion pounds. So the KEPCO thing is way cheaper. We make it too expensive because our regulations are over the top, ridiculous, whatever. So the legislation cuts through all that regulation. You borrow 12 billion pounds to build 2 of these, use public money, refinance after construction. You would do that at a profit. these things are extremely profitable to run, so investors will be very keen. It's the construction risk they're all scared of. So this is the way to do it. If you're serious, you want to keep the lights on and you want to be zero carbon, this is what you should do.
Alongside that, so you're advocating for the relatively rapid build of nuclear power stations through deregulation of a system that's tried and tested and works in Korea, and the Americans think it's safe for them, so it should be safe
Yeah, so it's
for us.
deregulation of our system because our system doesn't work. Leveraging trusted country processes that are already proven.
Alongside that, would you drill? Would you frack?
Definitely. So fracking, a lot of people talk about fracking as a silver bullet in the same way they talk about small modular reactors. But there's not, the evidence base isn't there because there hasn't been enough appraisal work done to know if we have economically viable resources that can be accessed through onshore fracking. Now, fracking itself is kind of a movable feast, if you like. Even conventional drilling involves some degree of fracking. But I think what we should do is lift the ban, impose some sensible restrictions around seismic activity. The seismic limits at the moment are so low that it's threatening geothermal production. I think it's set at something like 0.5 on the Richter scale, which, I mean, if you dropped a tennis ball down a mine shaft, you'd get 0.5 on the Richter scale. You need to be at about 3 before you notice it. So if you experienced an earthquake of 3, your crockery might rattle a bit in the cupboard. I think you need to be at around 5 before you have structural damage. But the Richter scale is a logarithmic scale, so each 1 point you move up is a 10 times increase in power. So that's a really big difference. So basically, you could significantly relax the seismic thresholds without actually creating anything that people would even notice, let alone that would cause any harm. And then the other thing you need to do is have some sensible regulation around water use because hydraulic fracking uses a lot of water. But beyond that, just let the market figure it out. Let them go and do the appraisals. If it turns out we've got viable resources, then the market will deliver them if you remove these unnecessary restrictions. And if not, then there might be resources that can be accessed through conventional drilling. And certainly there's a lot more we can be doing in the North Sea, which we should be doing. It makes no sense to import if we can produce domestically.
And should there be carbon taxes on fracking and oil production?
No, no. We should abolish carbon taxes altogether. Because the thing is, the carbon taxes aren't achieving anything. All they're doing is making energy more expensive and incentivizing deindustrialization. And if you deindustrialize, you don't reduce consumption. We've closed our blast furnaces. We haven't stopped using steel. Now we're just having to import more of it. Mostly we're getting it from Asia. The energy is much dirtier there, so the carbon footprint of that steel is much higher. And then shipping steel halfway around the world uses a massive amount of energy because it's big, heavy stuff. So that's kind of a stupid thing to do. And it makes no sense from an environmental perspective. So the way these carbon taxes are structured just doesn't work. Now, the UK and Europe are talking about bringing in a carbon border adjustment mechanism. That will be extremely inflationary. And I don't think the economy is in any kind of shape to bear the sort of inflation that would result from that. So I think that the most pragmatic approach is just to abolish carbon taxes altogether.
My hardest question for you, and I want you to do your best with this, sincerely.
Okay.
I want you to put yourself in the shoes of government. I'm not going to name names, you can if you want, but the government of the day who are pushing hard for net zero and looking to lead the world in doing this and so on and so forth. And I want you to give
The
an honest,
hubris of that, by the way.
and I want you to give the best, genuine, the best appraisal you can, or sorry, put yourself in their shoes. Why are they taking the path that they currently, they're not evil human beings, I think, regardless of how much we may or may not, anybody listening may or may not support the process. So why, given the range of concerns, heavy concerns that you espouse on this issue here and elsewhere you've spoken about it, why is it that they are following the, they're not stupid, they may be ignorant, I'll leave that for you up to you to argue or not. But they're not stupid people. They have a civil service behind them who may not be particularly well scientifically trained, but again, they're not stupid. There's a climate change committee. Some of those people presumably are scientists. We have other countries.
Not very many, unfortunately. The people at the top are not.
We have, hold all that, we have countries with lots of smart, educated people, Denmark, Germany, and so forth, who, as you've explained, are doing something similar to us in terms of working very rapidly towards net zero. So given all your concerns, why is it that these not stupid people are taking the course of action that they are?
Ideology. So we see in the civil service ideological capture. Since Gordon Brown gave the civil service independence and removed their accountability to ministers, the civil service has essentially become corrupted. Now, I don't mean that in a financial sense. There's not like envelopes of cash or whatever. I mean, in an ideological sense, it's become politicized. I talk quite a lot with the Conservatives, and they've expressed quite a bit of surprise at the diversity of opinion that exists within the market, which they didn't appreciate when they were in office, because they would ask their officials for information and they got only really one point of view, which was heavily influenced by the Green lobby. Now, added to that, you have, as I mentioned before, not that many people who are scientific. So if you have an ideology and you lack the scientific training to challenge that ideology, that's a very bad recipe. The other thing that's extremely dangerous with this current government is they do not listen. Like Ed Miliband will not speak to people who do not share his views. It's impossible to get through to them. Now, I speak with people who work at regulated utilities, and actually DESNZ has a statutory duty to engage with regulated utilities. They've had to remind the department of this duty before they could even get meetings with officials, never mind with ministers. So there's a great reluctance for them to engage with people who have dissenting views. Now, Kemi Badenoch, to her credit, when she gave the speech a few months ago where she said, right, we're no longer going to do the whole net zero 2050 thing, she said, we want to talk to everyone and we want to have people in the room that disagree. So we get that diversity of opinion so that we can land on some policies that make sense. Earlier this afternoon, I had a really constructive call with a senior person at Ofgem, because I am quite critical of Ofgem in various different ways. Their response to that is to reach out to me and say, can we hear your dissenting views? Can you give us your alternative perspectives? And they've done this on multiple occasions on a range of different topics, because they want to challenge their assumptions to do their job better. This is a very mature and responsible approach, and I give them a huge amount of credit for doing that. So I might criticize the way they regulate certain aspects of the market, but the fact that they're willing then to listen to that criticism and see what they can take away from it is extremely positive. The government doesn't do that, and specifically the Labour Party doesn't do that. And so they don't have anybody giving them real challenge. Now, I think that nobody is so good that all of their ideas are good, that they can never have some way of improving. But if you isolate yourself and build walls around yourself where you'll only listen to people who share your views and reinforce your echo chamber, and particularly if you're not technically minded in the first place, that is just a recipe for disaster. Now, you look at what's happening elsewhere in the world. Clearly, the US under the Trump administration is now going a very different route. Trump says, and so does Chris Wright, that the route to economic prosperity is cheap energy. I think you'll struggle to find people that disagree with that. That is a fairly orthodox view. Their disagreement is over how you achieve cheap energy. You've seen in Germany, now there's massive pushback from German industry around the Energiewende and its successors. And this didn't cut through to the German public until Volkswagen announced factory closures in Germany. At the end of last year, VW said it was going to close its factories and move production to China. And that was the point where the penny dropped to the German public. And effectively, that brought down the Scholz government and forced the early election. Now, the successor government is being extremely, I think, poorly advised in essentially continuing those same policies. And I think the next election in Germany will punish them quite severely. They've taken an anybody but the AfD approach, which has led them to continue doing the things that the voters were objecting to. But German industry is getting more vocal now about the need to change course. And Germany is now actually reconsidering its position on nuclear. They've seen their emissions go up again because they shut nuclear. That meant they had to rely more on coal, and they use the dirtiest form of coal, lignite. They've actually been dismantling wind farms to expand lignite mines.
Oh, wow.
So we are actually seeing the start of a change of direction in a lot of countries. The French, they've also pulled back on their renewables ambitions. The French government wrote a report a year or so ago about reclaiming sovereignty over their energy policy and pointed out that they already had a very decarbonized electricity grid because of nuclear. And so it made zero sense for them to start faffing about with wind and solar, which has all the intermittency and low energy density challenges, when they've got a vastly superior solution already in operation. Their problem was they stopped building them. So now they've got a plan to build more reactors. They've got one they've just opened, and now they're planning to do more. So we're seeing changes of even in Australia, they're talking about renewables less. They're talking about nuclear. I just did this interview this morning with Radio Sydney where they were saying, it's to so many of us, it doesn't make sense that we're trying to operate modern economies on weather-based generation. And so I actually think there is a lot of fresh thinking going on around this, that in a lot of places, the dissenting views are less of a minority now than they have been. The blackout in Spain, I think, was also a wake-up call around how hard it is to operate grids designed for alternating current with technologies that don't produce alternating current, that produce direct current. It's the very definition of a square peg in a round hole, but that creates risk. That whole situation in Spain, turns out, was one faulty inverter at a solar farm created a frequency oscillation that also caused voltage drops. And then you had a whole load of assets that weren't meeting their grid code obligations. That was wind and solar weren't meeting their fault ride through all their power factor obligations. Conventional generation did meet its fault ride through, but not its reactive power needs. There were transformers that weren't tapping correctly, and the grid operator failed to schedule enough reactive power and failed to respond appropriately to the voltage fluctuations. So all of these things caused the blackout, but it all started with that one solar farm with its dodgy electronics. And that is showing us that the energy transition is creating fundamental instability in our power grids that are hard to manage. And this, unless we change course, and this was part of what I was discussing with Ofgem, this is going to be really dangerous. And 11 people died in Iberia, so this is no joke, right? This was very benign weather conditions. It wasn't too hot, it wasn't too cold, like a Goldilocks scenario. If that had been in Britain in the winter, you can bet it would have been more than 11 people.
Yes, I mean, just to be clear, and again, obviously you know a lot more about this than I do, but you'd have things like, I mean, everything. It's impossible to overestimate how many things would shut down. I mean, traffic lights would stop working, cars would drive through traffic lights, lifts would stop working, and people would get stuck in lifts. Heating systems would stop. All sorts of massive problems, and of course, the elderly would probably be the most vulnerable here. It's extremely dangerous situation, particularly in winter.
Falling over in the home.
Yeah.
If you imagine 5 p.m. early December. So at 5 o'clock, early December, it's still school term time. 5 o'clock, you've got children coming home from school, got no street lights, no traffic lights, no ambient light from buildings. In a city like London, where you've got all of these stupid bollards in the road that are normally lit up, they wouldn't be lit up anymore. Urban drivers are terrible at driving in the dark as well. I live quite rurally here. You might tell from all the beams behind me. So we don't have street lights. We're all quite used to driving around in the dark. If I go and visit my friends in the evening in the village, I take a really powerful torch with me, far more powerful than the one on my phone. So, you'd have children and, people stumbling around on the pavements with their phones, and that would be the only source of light other than car headlights. As you say, you'd have no heating, people stuck in lifts, people stuck on transport, trains, underground trains, trams. wherever you are in the country. If it's winter time, there'll be no heating, so you'd be cold. You'd be sitting on a train stuck on the middle of nowhere with no heating. Um, you would have, and then, but what killed the people in Iberia? One person died in a house fire associated with candles. The other 10 people died in mishaps relating to the use of medical equipment in the home. So basically, they had ventilators with backup generators, so ventilators for artificial breathing. And the backup generators either didn't work at all, in which case the person using the ventilator suffocated. And in one case, the generator did work, but it gave off carbon monoxide. So not only did the patient suffocate, but two of their relatives also suffocated from the carbon monoxide poisoning. It's not, I've been accused in the past of fear mongering when I've said that blackouts would cause fatalities. And that if we're not careful, that blackouts are a realistic prospect. I think on both of those counts now, it's been shown that I'm not fear-mongering, that we need to take this stuff seriously. And we can't. Why is it that people say they care about climate change? You know, for most people, it's because they worry about the impact on lives and livelihoods that climate change might have. So it's pretty perverse then to enact policies designed to tackle climate change that create harm to lives and livelihoods, that make fuel poverty worse, that make energy less secure, and therefore risking people's lives. This is not an appropriate strategy, that you're just swapping one potential harm for another. And that's not a good approach. And it's bad government. You know, the first job of governments is to keep their people safe and not to put them at risk, and not to swap one set of risk for another set of risk. And so I think they need to be a lot less idealistic about the energy transition and about energy policy, and really look at the realities, really look at the real risks that they're dealing with, look at the real costs. We have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world. You cannot say that's because of gas, because any country that's importing gas is facing the same international gas prices. We're not the only country in the world that's importing gas. So why is it that our electricity prices are so much more expensive? Our gas prices, by the way, are only the 15th highest. So why is our industrial electricity price the number one highest in the developed world, and our domestic electricity price is the fourth highest?
And what's the answer?
So lots of these narratives don't add up. Sorry?
And what is the answer, briefly?
The answer is, well, certainly stop the Clean Power 2030 ambition. It's not achievable, and it has too many risks associated
No, but
with
sorry,
it. So if you want to go,
butt in. So I think, forgive me, you can flesh this out. I think it's the case that government loads onto our electricity bills the costs of policy. I think they're sometimes
everything,
euphemistically called policy
yes,
costs. So it goes on to the electricity bill. Now I heard, can I just name check here? Emma Pinchbeck. Does that ring a bell at all? No, maybe not. Maybe
yes,
it does. I heard, I'm sure she's a good friend of yours. I heard
a
Emma
history
Pinchbeck.
graduate, if I'm not wrong.
I'm not sure. I wouldn't know those details. And she was lamenting the fact that policy costs, in other words, some of the tax that we're paying to subsidize changes towards renewables, those policy costs are loaded onto electricity because we're inevitably moving from gas and oil to electricity, and actually we need those electricity prices that people pay to be low to encourage the population to see that electricity is the future, and that's where we need to be moving. So for example, switching out from gas boilers to heat pumps, and
Yeah.
moving from petrol cars to electric cars.
So electric cars, by the way, are not environmentally sustainable, so nobody should do that anyway. If you look at how they're made, this is not a good thing to do for the planet. Um, so yes, electricity prices are artificially high, and recover. So the reason for this was because they said, right, we want the polluter to pay. So we want to encourage people to cut their energy use, and therefore we'll make energy more expensive. But the trouble is that's incredibly regressive, because if you're affluent, you can afford to get a heat pump or an electric car, you can afford better insulation, you can afford more efficient appliances. If you're not affluent, you can't afford that stuff. If you live in a rented home, you can't just go and change the insulation and the appliances anyway. Like, it's not, you can't do it. It changes the fabric of a building you don't own. So So this harms the people who can influence their consumption the least. And so therefore it's just an unfair policy. Now, it's not just renewable subsidies, though. The government does all sorts of other rubbish. Right. So you have the energy company obligation, which requires suppliers to go and insulate people's homes to reduce their energy consumption. Well, suppliers don't know anything about construction. That's really inefficient. Why do suppliers need to then go and hire loads of builders and, building experts and all the rest of it to do that? That makes no sense. There are other, actually local authorities should be in charge of that. They already control building control and planning processes. They should be doing that, not suppliers. You've got the warm homes discount. That's straight up wealth redistribution, where energy suppliers take money from one group of customers to give a discount to another group of customers. Like literally, the way it works is they have to call up the DWP to find out which of their consumers are eligible for the warm home discount. Then they work out how much that'll cost. And then they look at all the people who don't receive it and charge them extra money plus an admin fee so that they can give the discount to the people who are eligible. That's just pure wealth redistribution. It's not the job of private companies. Then you've got the smart meter installation. We're the only country that's asked suppliers to do it. It's network equipment. It should be installed by network companies, right? But the costs of that's being recovered through bills. Then, of course, you have the subsidy costs. Now, some of those subsidy costs are hidden into the wholesale buckets that Ofgem has. So the CFD is called a wholesale cost, which is not a policy cost. The capacity market's also put into the wholesale bucket, but that's basically backup for renewables. So that's also a policy cost. Then you've got all the other, like the legacy renewables obligation, feed-in tariffs. You've got the climate change levy. You've got the carbon prices. They get added onto the wholesale price of electricity before it gets to the bill stage. You've got all sorts of other bits and pieces, like there's support for so heavy industries exempt from the environmental levies, so that gets charged to everyone else. So all of this extra stuff, it should actually be recovered through taxation. That would be the fairer way. But even if you took all of that stuff away from electricity bills, gas would still be cheaper. So you're not really going to incentivize people to switch from gas heating to electric heating because gas is setting the price of the electricity. So it's pretty obvious that if gas is setting the price of electricity and your gas boiler in your home is probably like 80% efficient and your gas power station is not more than 60% efficient, then you're going to be better off financially if you just heat your home with gas than if you heated it with a heat pump.
I'm given everything that you said and the deep and wide-ranging knowledge that you have on these critical topics, it's very impressive. I'm very interested to when I hear people like you speak, or it might be somebody speaking about a different topic and they're not in government, they're not a policymaker, but they clearly know their onions. I mean, they may be wrong about some things, their opinions can be argued, but nonetheless, they have valuable ideas, information, experience to share. I'm interested in who is listening to them over and above actually the many people who will be hearing, particularly you online and on YouTube and so forth. I know you have your own channel now, which people must check out. I certainly will be. But when, for example, you speak to Ofgem, without giving away what you can't, I'm not digging for that. Who do you speak to and how long do you get to speak to them for? And what do you think happens after you've put the phone down?
So I've been speaking to some pretty senior people, and what they've tended to do is, okay, we think that what you're saying is quite important to listen to. So now you need to go and talk to the teams that are actually doing the work, because obviously the most senior people are directing the work rather than doing the work. So then I speak to different people at different levels to exchange ideas. Now, even just that I think is really valuable because so one example, I met with the team that was working on the new competition framework, and it was four of them. They were all competition economists, and they were explaining to me how they were trying to avoid harm in the market. And I went, oh gosh, that's really interesting. Why are you not seeking to maximize opportunity and benefit? So essentially, this is just a different framing of the same question. But they were like, wow, that's a sort of radically different perspective. Um, and so I think getting them outside their little bubbles, if you like, um, is a really good thing. So you might not be able to point to and say, oh yes, they changed that specific policy as a result of our conversation. I think that's unrealistic, but they shouldn't do that on the basis of one conversation anyway. It should be they should be getting input from a range of people. And by talking to people in this informal way, the way that I've been doing with them, and I hope others are as well, I think that gives them access to different perspectives in a way that's freer than a formal consultation process would be. I do occasionally contribute to consultations, but I'm pretty busy. As you mentioned, I'm a sole trader, so I don't have a team working with me. It's all just me. So it's much easier for me just to have a meeting and talk through my concerns. And they reach out to me and they say, oh, we read what you wrote about X and Y. Can we discuss it? Or senior people say, would you go meet my such and such a team to discuss your work in that particular area? And yeah, I mean, I think the very fact that they want to have those conversations is hugely positive.
Were
And I
you
assume it has some impact because otherwise they wouldn't bother, right? If they didn't care. And I've done
oh
enough of this engagement with Ofgem now that if they felt it wasn't useful, I'm sure they wouldn't do
I'm
it.
sure they're not.
So
I'm sure they're not faking it. I mean, I'm sure they really want to
there's no
hear
reason
what you've
to.
got to
I'm
say.
just a sole trader. So if they, there's no sort of like public pressure for them to go talk to
Right,
Kathryn Porter. You must,
right.
like you're not doing your job properly if you don't talk to her.
I'm sure you can take
Um,
great confidence that they really want to hear what you've got to say. I mean, for what it's worth, I'm sure of that. I'm interested. You mentioned that you've been speaking to a couple of political parties. Those parties are not in government, but one of them, the Tories, were until
yeah.
recently. Were you speaking to them while they were in government?
Well, yes, but in a more limited way. And this is interesting around the role of officials here because they were being discouraged by officials from talking to me on the basis that I'm too controversial. And I think that's quite problematic, really, because officials are by definition not elected. So it's not really their place to make those determinations. And certainly they could say to the minister, oh, this person might be considered a bit controversial. If the minister then says, well, I want to meet them anyway, that should be the end of it. There shouldn't be then any further effort at dissuasion, which now that I'm talking to them more, I learn that there was, significantly more efforts of dissuasion. So I do think that people are quite critical of the Conservatives, and they say, they left this mess and all the rest of it. And I definitely think some of the choices that they made were the wrong choices. The price cap was the wrong choice. The windfall tax on oil and gas was the wrong choice. Not pushing nuclear forward faster was the wrong choice. But I do also have some sympathy that when you find over a period of a decade or 14 years, and given that the Gordon Brown decision to make the civil service independent happened quite soon before the Conservatives came into office. That would have been a slow process. It's not something that you would necessarily notice happening in real time. And really only when they left office did they realise the extent to which they'd been walled in. But there's enough people telling Labour that this is the case that they should be interested. And it's very interesting that Claire Coutinho, in before the Conservatives left office, she implemented a project for the civil service to calculate the full system costs of each different generation technology. So not just the levelized cost, but the full system cost. Miliband cancelled that project. So the question is why? Why would you not want to know the answer to that question?
I'll leave that hanging. Two more questions, and then I will let you get back to your busy schedule.
Okay.
I I keep hearing that although the Chinese, now the Chinese are what the second or third biggest emitters of CO2 in the world, something like that. That although they are producing, a new coal-fired power station or opening one once a week or whatever it is, some extraordinary rate, that nonetheless they are predicted to hit their peak CO2 production by the 2030s. And because they're so advanced in terms of their development of other technologies, renewable technologies, for example, solar, that in the not too distant future, they're going to be kind of on the right side of things, that they're going to be, very helpful on a global scale in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I don't think it's likely. So recently, the Chinese government has decided to put limits on the penetration of wind and solar because of grid stability concerns. So I think we're actually going to see a slowdown in the deployment of wind and solar. And I think those forecasts are probably out of date in terms of those developments because they were relatively recent. It's just not likely. I mean, you might get some impact because of slowing economic growth in China, so a wider economic impact on their energy consumption. Um, but I don't think you're going to see too much more, certainly not towards weather-dependent intermittent renewables. They are building nuclear at quite a rate, so that you have that benefit of decarbonisation. If they do a nuclear-led decarbonisation, then that would be obviously positive for the environment. The other big problem with coal is that actually it's a bigger problem than carbon dioxide is the particulate pollution that creates immediate health detriments to people who live near the power station, and all the poor air quality issues and so on. That's actually a far greater concern than the carbon dioxide.
That's interesting. That's interesting. One more question from my father,
Okay.
who's very interested in clean hydrogen, I suppose you would call it these days. Is that right? Clean hydrogen? Or he says, is it cost effective to store
No.
surplus energy from, probably not, from wind turbines by using the by using the spare electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and obviously reversing the process, you generate
Electrolysis is the word you're
electricity.
looking
So
for.
electricity is the word I am looking for. Thank you. What say you? Because it produces no nasty stuff, right? I mean, it's
Well, no, I
fantastic in
mean,
that
that's not
sense.
actually true either, right? Because if you burn hydrogen in the air, it gives off water vapor, which is also a greenhouse gas. So just because it's not giving off carbon dioxide doesn't mean it's GHG neutral. It's not. Um, so hydrogen is the Houdini of the periodic table. It is the smallest molecule. It can't escape from anywhere, which makes it very difficult to store, very difficult to transport. If you transport methane around the gas pipeline network, you've got losses of about 2.5 to 3%. It's estimated to be 10 times higher for hydrogen. So you might lose a third of your hydrogen by volume just moving it around the country. So that leaves you with quite a big challenge because you either then have to produce the hydrogen right next to your wind farm, but then are you also going to use it there? Probably not. Or you try and transport the electricity to somewhere else and then produce the hydrogen close to where it might be needed. Now the equipment that you need for electrolysis is also extremely expensive. These things cost billions of pounds. It just doesn't seem, it seems like it's going to be another tax, put it that way. Even if the wind is essentially for free, although obviously it's not for free because you still have to pay for the machines and they cost billions of pounds. The whole process, the hydrogen cycle, is likely to be pretty expensive. So I really don't see this as being viable. I think that hydrogen might play a limited role within industrial clusters. I think because you can get high temperature heat from burning it. So if you wanted to move away from the use of methane at high temperature applications, you've got to burn something. And so burning hydrogen would give you the high temperatures. And then maybe you could use small modular reactors to produce the hydrogen that you then burn to get the high temperature heat. But you'd have to do it all in a very local way. It's not really feasible to be doing this other than locally. And I do think it's going to be very limited in its application. And this is why we've seen so many hydrogen projects being cancelled in the last year. Many hydrogen projects have been cancelled because people have just woken up and these economics just don't work.
But JCB's hasn't been cancelled, has it?
No, but Equinor has, and I think they've got a much bigger, should we say, strategic view on this.
Okay. Oh well. So hydrogen's probably gonna end up failing as well in the long run in most senses. Okay, that's a shame.
Yeah, but probably not as dramatically as carbon capture. I mean, that's already a busted flush.
Already, because hasn't the government just put in a lot of money to support the development of carbon capture in the
Yeah,
UK?
but only after everyone else has given up because billions of dollars globally have been spent on carbon capture, and there are still no large-scale projects anywhere that don't rely on hydrocarbon production and processing for their economics. And this idea that you're going to use it with gas power stations is completely unproven. There was a handful of projects with coal power stations, which it's an easier technology, and they were more expensive to build and captured less than expected. And I think all except for Boundary Dam in Canada have closed. And Boundary Dam uses the carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery. In an net zero world, then you're not likely to be doing that. So it's, I would say, the height of hubris to think that the UK can succeed where everyone else has failed. This is more money that's going to be added to bills. And that's the trouble. Miliband is doing this through levy, and it just doesn't attract the same level of scrutiny that taxes imposed by the Treasury do. So there's a big accountability gap there. And, they're always going on about this massive economic black hole. Well, you could plug that black hole by not spending £22 billion with an £8 billion backup on carbon capture, which has been proved so far to be a total disaster.
Right, we must finish on a vaguely positive note. How do you see things playing out once things have got to their nadir? Once, whatever it takes for, in your view at least, for our policies to rapidly change in this country, how do you think that's going to play out? And when perhaps do you predict we might finally start to really clearly pivot?
So the when is difficult. I mean, not later than 2029, because I can't see the Labour government being re-elected. And I think Conservatives and Reform would be the realistic replacements, and they both want to do something different. Although I'd hope that we might see some return to reality before then, but you can't hold your breath, basically. What does it look like? Well, it'll be more gas and more nuclear. And I think one of the problems that we have is that the way people talk about fossil fuels is they treat them as if they're all the same in terms of their environmental impacts, and they're just not. Gas is massively cleaner than oil, which is cleaner than coal. So, I mean, I'm quite against burning oil, really, because there's many more useful and interesting things that you can do with oil that don't involve setting it on fire. But gas is, I think the idea that we can move away from gas, either in electricity generation or in heating, in meaningfully to change that within the next decade is really unrealistic, given where we are today. And even simple things like if you wanted to install lots of heat pumps, you don't have enough people to do it. Like even the government's 600,000 a year target is challenged by lack of installers. And 600,000 a year is nothing really when you look at how many households you actually have. So it's just a much bigger task, I think, than people have appreciated. But then methane isn't that bad. And so this comes back to this whole question about mitigation versus prevention. And, maybe we should be focusing our efforts differently. And as far as electricity generation is concerned, we should absolutely be going for nuclear, and we should be going for gas, because gas is probably still quicker to build than nuclear, although with the long lead time on turbines, that might not be the case anymore. But yeah, I mean, that's really where you have to go. And there has to be a much bigger focus on security of supply. And people have started talking about that more, but they haven't necessarily been acting on it in the right way. We need to really take it seriously. Security of supply is actually the most important element of the energy trilemma, followed by affordability and then sustainability. Because you need to look at the proximity of harm, basically. So blackouts will kill people straight away. Lack of affordability kills people over a slightly longer time frame, and environmental things will kill people over an even longer time frame than that. So your risk, you have to look at the proximity adjusted risks and avoid the things that would kill you immediately. Like take the strongest efforts to avoid those.
On that note, we must end it. Kathryn Porter, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome.